and welcome to the Newsmakers Review the Week, where we bring you the best of the show from the past 7 days. Over the next 30 minutes, we'll be looking at the rise of Donald Trump in U.S. politics as he promises to make America great again, the 5-year anniversary of the Egyptian revolution that toppled former President Hosni Mubarak, and Denmark's controversial move to curb refugee rights. On Monday, our newsmaker was American presidential hopeful Donald Trump. The businessman is the latest phenomenon to hit U.S. politics. He started his bid for the presidency with few seeing him as a real frontrunner. But now, just 10 months before America chooses its 45th president, Donald Trump's race for the White House is gaining traction. Sandra Gutman filed this report on how the Trump effect is driving a wedge straight down the middle of the Republican Party.
I'm Donald Trump, and I'm running for president.
Total and complete shutdown of Muslims.
So much winning.
The Second Amendment. Boom. Guns.
I am so tired of this politically correct.
Love him or loathe him, there's one thing American voters can agree on. Donald Trump has shaken up the presidential race.
President Donald Trump knows how to make America great.
The billionaire tycoon continues to cement his status as the Republican frontrunner, blowing his rivals out of the water. The latest polls have Trump receiving 35% of the national GOP vote. His closest rival, Ted Cruz, trails behind with 18%. As Trump courts the electorate, his tactics are leaving many people in Washington perplexed.
The Trump campaign for months now has had a dustbin of history-like quality to it. From the vacuous sloganeering to the outright lies to even the fake hair, the whole carnival barker routine that we've seen for some time now.
Can a man who's been called impulsive, offensive, and a racist really have a shot at the White House? Polarization has become a defining feature of the U.S. political landscape. A survey by the Pew Research Center found that Republicans and Democrats are further apart ideologically than at any point in the last 2 decades. Partisan animosity in Congress has also increased over the same period, with each party sharing a highly negative view of the other, a stumbling block for President Obama's reform efforts.
It's one of the few regrets of my presidency that the rancor and suspicion between the parties has gotten worse instead of better.
Other trends to note: fewer Americans are now in the middle of the political spectrum, with values shifting further to the left or right, and a growing dissatisfaction with government officials. That's pushing the public to look for Washington outsiders, a description that fits Donald Trump.
He's not a politician, he's a businessman, he's a leader, and he also has a lot of relationships around the world.
His brutal honesty, his willingness to want to fix America, want to fix the problem, and not leave it and put it underneath the rug like everybody else has.
From the next 6 months, Republican delegates will narrow the field before July's national convention. With establishment favorites falling by the wayside, the stage is set for fringe candidates to steal the show. The emergence of Donald Trump and second-place Ted Cruz reveals the factions within the party and indeed middle America. Both men are seen as divisive populists, more likely to burn bridges than heal wounds. At this stage, many Republicans on Capitol Hill could be preparing for a nominee who can grab headlines, but not the Oval Office. Sandra Gutman, The Newsmakers.
Well, to discuss the Trump effect, I was joined on the Newsmakers by Ron Meyer, editor of Red Alert Politics, and Theodore Roosevelt Malach, an informal advisor to Donald Trump. Take a look at the debate that ensued when I asked if Trump really can go all the way and become president of America.
He is a conservative. He has been a conservative. He has conservative positions. He's a doer, not a politician. He's an outsider, not an insider. He obviously challenges the establishment, but I think eventually they too will come around because they don't have
hold
another
on
candidate.
a second. How is he an outsider? He is a consummate insider. He's donated to almost every single politician on both sides of the aisle in this whole city. I'm in Washington, D.C. Hold on a second. Hold on a second. He has given to politicians, and here's the other thing.
I think
he has used eminent domain and bought off politicians for his land deals.
I'll use my time and not beg for some of yours, but his conservative backers' long and growing list. You know, when Ronald Reagan ran in 1980, and I was around and part of that, he had a candidate named George Bush challenging him from the establishment, and he beat him, and a lot of people made the same statements about Ronald Reagan that they're making about Donald Trump now. If you think about
including
what
Donald
he did in his
Trump, by the way, who
administration,
didn't support Ronald Reagan.
So if you think about what Trump would actually do as a president, I think that you'd find an active, positive president who actually brought America back from its death spiral, both economically and had a very, very different foreign policy that engaged the world and put America first.
Monday also marked 5 years since the beginning of the Egyptian uprising, which eventually toppled former President Hosni Mubarak. Since then, the country has suffered from extreme political turbulence, a military coup, and political apathy. Now, a human rights group says that state repression in Egypt is the worst it has been for decades. The Newsmakers' Ashraf Helmi filed this report on how the country reached where it is today.
January 25th, 2011, a key moment in Egypt's modern history. An uprising that had people demanding democratic change. The protests that started in Tunisia would become known as the Arab Spring, and they'd sweep over Egypt, a country that had endured 3 decades of rule under one man, Hosni Mubarak. Over the next 5 years, the country would undergo political upheaval. Free elections would bring to power Mohamed Morsi, but a military coup backed by public support would later remove him and install Egypt's current president and former general, Abdel Fattah el-Sisi. After 4 years of political paralysis, Egypt once again has a parliament. Sisi came to power 2 years ago. During that time, he announced more than 300 decrees, and now he's given members of parliament just 15 days to ratify all of them. Some are controversial. MPs have already approved an anti-terrorism law that allows military courts to try civilians on terrorism-related charges. The same law protects security services when they employ what the government calls proportionate use of force. It also allows journalists to be fined thousands of dollars for contradicting the official version of any militant attack. Last year, police cracked down on opposition activists. Many were members of the banned Muslim Brotherhood. Tens of thousands have been arrested. Non-governmental organizations in Egypt say 475 people died at the hands of police. 640 were victims of police torture, and a further 464 were detained by the security services and are currently unaccounted for. Under a draft law, the four-finger sign used by supporters of the Muslim Brotherhood will be banned. As Egyptians mark the day they took to the streets to call for democratic change, political power has become concentrated in the hands of one man. Mubarak, Morsi, and now Sisi have all been accused of acting like all-powerful leaders. And as this country's history shows, that's something Egyptians know all too well. Ashraf Helmi, The Newsmakers.
I was joined by Thanasis Kambanis, author of the book Once Upon a Revolution, an Egyptian Story, and a fellow at the Century Foundation. This is what he had to say when I asked him if Egypt can become a democracy under Sisi or if it needs another revolution.
Long before we can talk about Egypt becoming a democracy, we have to ask, can Egypt be governed effectively? Just the basics, food, security, shelter, and maybe a modicum of transparency and freedom of expression. On those factors, on that basis, Sisi is failing abysmally. So the question of the next uprising for me is more just a question of timing. It's inevitable in outcome. And right now what I see is a very painful scenario in which misrule, incompetence, and repression by Sisi make a rupture, a popular uprising, or possibly another coup inevitable. But the outcome of that next challenge to central authority is not going to be a positive one, because we don't have a coherent opposition that is cohering and beginning to prepare to take over from Sisi. And that is as a design of the state oppression that Sisi has engineered. So he's trying to forestall a challenge to his rule by saying, hey, if you topple me, it's going to be chaos. And yet he's doing such a poor job that there will inevitably be such a challenge, and it will be followed by some version of chaos and probably yet another strong man destined to do poorly.
On Tuesday, Denmark passed a law to seize assets exceeding $1,450 from refugees seeking asylum in the country. Once a champion of refugee rights, Denmark is now making a sharp U-turn with its new goal, saying it's trying to make itself less attractive to refugees. The Newsmakers' Yvette McCullough filed this report.
A highly controversial bill criticised across the board. Denmark's Prime Minister says it's simply misunderstood. The Danish Parliament has voted in a new law authorising the seizure of asylum seekers' valuables to pay for their stay in Denmark.
What has made this discussion start is more or less the fact that people have such an idea that Denmark is like some kind of paradise which you can just arrive to, and then you will get whatever you need, and that is not the case any longer.
The new law gives authorities the power to take any cash or valuables above $1,450. Necessities and sentimental items like wedding rings are excluded. Authorities say the rules bring migrants in line with welfare policies which apply to Danish citizens. The bill also includes changes to refugees' rights to be reunited with their families. Asylum seekers who have applied for temporary residency will have to wait 3 years before their family can join them, instead of only 1 under the current law. This affects around a fifth of Denmark's refugees. The United Nations has warned the law violates human rights.
We think it's fair and reasonable that those asylum seekers who do bring enough assets with them should cover the costs of their food and lodging during the asylum process itself.
Denmark took in 20,000 refugees last year. It expects 25,000 this year. And some critics there say its generosity and resources are overwhelmed. Once a champion of refugees' rights, the aim now is to make Denmark less appealing for asylum seekers. This law is being seen as symbolic.
Probably no refugees coming to Denmark have valuables in the level of 10,000 Danish kroner. So it is primarily a signal that don't go to Denmark. We are very tough up here.
This new law is not a law for refugees. It's a racist law by the Danish people. They don't tell you that you have to go back to the country that you came from, but slowly it becomes that way. Me and all my Iraqi friends, we will eventually go back to Baghdad.
Denmark is the latest European country to harden its stance to try to stem the flow of refugees, as the migrant crisis puts the EU's Schengen zone at risk. Hungary has closed its borders with Serbia, Croatia and Slovenia, while Macedonia has a fence under construction along its border with Serbia. These countries have also reimposed border controls. Several states say they will seek to extend temporary border controls for as long as 2 years. For refugees fleeing war and persecution, the road to Europe is becoming longer and more difficult, and the promise of a better life less promising. The once warm welcome in countries like Denmark has now turned chilly. Yvette McCullough, The Newsmakers.
Well, joining me on Tuesday's show to discuss Denmark's newest law was Killian Kleinschmidt, former manager of Jordan's Zaatari refugee camp, and Anders Primdahl Vistisen, member of the right-leaning Danish People's Party. I asked Vistisen if Denmark was being misunderstood.
I think in Denmark this is a question about equality. If you are going to be eligible for Danish welfare, you first have to spend your own money, and we are just implying the same principle, even with even higher thresholds for refugees and migrants coming in. And we are only seizing the valuables to pay for costs that they put on the Danish welfare model. So we don't think it's unfair to ask people who have means to pay for their own stay in Denmark, as we would for a Dane or a German or a Norwegian or an American.
Killian, that's just to pay for costs. What do you think?
Well, I pity governments which have to resort to such measures. Let's not forget, these people have spent a lot of money to actually come. Instead of having a decent, organized, legal way and a sharing of the burden, resettlement programs we the humanitarian organizations have been asking for a long time to help the region, and not much has happened. And here's people spending most of what they have, most of what they have to actually come. And then to take them away the last little bit, and claiming that this will help to cover the costs. I mean, I think this is ridiculous.
On Wednesday, our newsmaker was sport. After months of one scandal after the next emerging across different disciplines, continents and governing bodies, we asked how many more blows the world can take before it can no longer recover. Here's our sports correspondent, Santos.
The titles and trophies coveted by sports elite and the spectacles that are the obsession of billions are now on the defence, battling relentless match-fixing, corruption and doping scandals. As the bar continues to be lifted and the payoffs increase, sport could end up the biggest loser. As jaded fans continue to be let down and athletes are sidelined by uneven playing fields, each scandal is becoming less shocking. Without trust in sports, can people really keep their passion for the game?
2015 and now 2016 are the two worst years for sport in history in integrity terms. We've seen football, we've seen athletics, cycling the year before. So many sports have been exposed for their vulnerability to match fixing and in fact to internal corruption. I'm afraid this all has to come out.
Sports governing bodies are meant to police and protect, but critics say their weakness have created a corrupt culture, and allegations of foul play exist across the board. The former poster boy for Union Cycliste International, Lance Armstrong. After years of denial, the 7-time Tour de France winner was finally caught on doping. Not only did the UCI fail to stop the sport's endemic doping problem, its former head was found to have colluded with Armstrong to hide it. In November last year, Russia was banned from international athletics after a report accused it of state-sponsored doping. The report also found the association meant to catch out cheats was itself complicit.
The information the IC has very clearly indicates that the disruption of the Federation emanated from the very top, the President, Lamine Diack.
The International Cricket Council has been dogged by its inability to end match fixing that's plagued the sport for more than a decade. One of the biggest scandals was unearthed back in 2000 when South African Hansie Cronje admitted he'd accepted money to throw matches. And just earlier this month, 2 South African players were suspended for allegedly fixing T20 matches. As the first Grand Slam of 2016 opened, tennis became the latest sport clouded by match-fixing allegations. A media report claimed the Association of Tennis Professionals is aware of 16 players who repeatedly throw matches, but has failed to take action. But perhaps the biggest scandal belongs to football. After 17 years as the head of FIFA, Sepp Blatter was banned from football for 8 years over an undisclosed $2 million payment to UEFA President Michel Platini. 14 FIFA officials and associates are also facing FBI charges for rampant, systematic and deep-rooted corruption. Sporting cheats not only deprive clean athletes of medals and spots on the podium, they hurt their reputations and futures. Each scandal is a fresh betrayal to fans who were invested emotionally and financially. Faced with these unprecedented scandals, all the major sporting federations have promised to clean up their act.
We can't beg them for trust. We have to earn it, and we should not be in denial about that.
We will look at this thoroughly. There is a zero tolerance for this in our game.
Sport only survives because crowds keep coming back, and if trust in sport is lost, the fans and the sponsorship revenue they bring is lost with it. Lance Santos, the Newsmakers.
And Lance was here on set on Wednesday, and in Denmark was Jens Andersen, International Director of Play the Game. Here's what Lance had to say when I put it to him that sports fans had maybe too much trust.
We're only at the tip of the iceberg with tennis. This is how these scandals start, because, and I think saying that we've got too much trust in the sport is probably wrong. I think we have too much leniency in sport, because if this was a business, for example, look at a major business, the leaders of the business would be sacked straight away. Sepp Blatter would go, Sebastian Coe would be long gone out the door, given what's happened on his playing field. And in terms of tennis, why are we only hearing about this right now? And why have people been allowed to get there? This will then come and uncover the greater scandal. But in terms of saying as a collective unit, yes, completely so. These are certain individuals within a sport that are cheating a way to make more money. Whereas if you look at FIFA and you look at the doping allegations as a wider context, as Russia, as a state-funded doping, as they called it, that is much, much bigger than this. And that is huge bodies destroying the game rather than individuals looking to make a buck.
Mm-hmm. Jens, we have people following the money. They're looking for suspicious betting patterns. We have whistleblowers coming out of these various sports. I wonder, just long term, how difficult is it going to be to actually stamp out all this corruption? Because isn't it just an arms race, right? When we look at some of these sports, they're highly sophisticated. There's so many variables. In tennis, a bet could be on you serving a double fault in the third game of the third set. In cricket, it could be about how you shine the ball or bowling a no ball. So aren't those just maybe going to become more and more sophisticated, and authorities are always going to have to play catch up with the cheats?
I think you're right that this is a huge challenge and it's a long-term challenge. We won't have match-fixing, doping and corruption organizations eradicated tomorrow. I think one of the essential solutions must be to have more efficient and credible sports governing bodies, such as the international federations, the International Tennis Federation, FIFA, etc. What has happened over the last 40 years is that they have built up a billion-dollar global industry, but still using the framework that you would set up for local associations, meaning their internal structure is completely inefficient and there is no monitoring from the outside because they are associations, so they are supposed to act freely without government intervention and so on. And in this way, they have succeeded in creating a bubble that could play by its own rules, even if it was to be compared with any other multinational billion-dollar industry.
This week in Picture This, we featured the Zika virus, which is spreading explosively in the Americas, according to the World Health Organization. The group also estimated that there could be 3 to 4 million infections in the region over a 12-month period. Take a look. Well, that was the week that was. A week that saw Donald Trump's campaign gain even greater traction in the build-up to next week's Iowa caucus. A week that Denmark passed a controversial new law allowing the authorities to seize refugees' valuables. And a week that we analyzed the state of democracy in Egypt 5 years after the fall of Hosni Mubarak. Next week, we'll be discussing the results of the Iowa caucus and what that will mean to the Republican presidential race. And we'll ask whether the world is prepared for the outbreak of the Zika virus. You've been watching the Newsmakers Review the Week with me, Imran Gata. As always, thank you for watching. Bye-bye.